Happy Wednesday, everybody. It's good to be back. I've got some thoughts for you today. I'm going to jump right into it and tell you what I've been working on with my own story ideas and the influences that have been rattling around in my head this week. So, right now I'm thinking back on my week and what I've done with my writing, and I'm trying to figure out what I guess it's the writer in me or the storyteller in me. I'm always trying to find some sort of thread or theme and think about what happened this week with my story ideas. And I think what happened was, I dealt with my most common struggle, my most notorious problem. I'm sure every writer has their kryptonite, but mine is definitely just death by too many options. I get caught up brainstorming, I get caught up with ideas, and I run off the rails, and I go down these rabbit holes, and I can never actually write anything or get anything done because I just have too many ideas, and I can never narrow anything down specifically enough to just stick to one story. That's a huge problem of mine, and something I've just learned about myself over the last couple years trying to do this. I don't think you can ever completely root out that weed from your creative garden, but I think probably what the best creatives do and the successful artists do is they learn to identify their own problems, and they, build systems and habits around that self-knowledge that enables them to be more successful. And to continue this gardening analogy, when you're really fucked, I would think, is when the vines and the weeds are growing all around you and you just don't realize it. You don't know what your problem is, and so you can't identify it. You know how they say that the first step to recovery, if you're an addict, is just admitting you have a problem. I think a lot of creatives suffer in that way, where they don't know what their problem is. They're just sort of struggling in the dark, or dealing with the same issue over and over again, and it never gets identified, and so they never have a good way of fixing it. So maybe you can tell I'm trying to find some silver lining for myself and what I've been dealing with lately, at least. So I'm still going around in this hamster wheel of ideas for my story and trying to narrow everything down to one specific story so that I can actually start. And that's annoying. And I always do that. And so the only silver lining I can think of is, at least now. So I was doing that this week. I was trying to start my story, but I was going off on these tangents, and everyone is exciting, and I get excited about whatever new idea I have, and it seems good at the time. But the only difference I would say now from maybe a few years ago when I started this writing thing is now I start to realize, I realize what I'm doing faster as I'm doing it. And I realize the mistake I'm making, and I consciously am always literally writing to myself saying, all right, cut the shit, get back to what's important, simplify. I'm always trying to, I realize what I'm doing more often, more quickly, and then I try to rein myself in. So if you've been listening along to the last few episodes, you know that what I'm doing is I have this sort of big global idea for this world called Tomorrow City, and what I'm doing is I'm trying to write the first story in that universe. And hopefully my ideal situation is that I would be able to write lots of stories in this universe, and I'd be able to write multiple characters and multiple stories all in this world of Tomorrow City. But right now, I'm just trying to make it as easy on myself as possible, just to write one story that's a sort of an introduction story to bring the reader into this world. And I want to do that in the way that sets a tone, sets the right tone for this world that I'm going to be writing in. And so I'm having all these sort of global ideas about who the villains are in this world, and who what the social structures are, and what the hierarchies are, and what's interesting and fun about this world, and what's mysterious about it, and how does it work. And I'm just trying to narrow it down to write the first. Well, I've chosen a protagonist, so I know who my protagonist is for the first story, and I'm trying to write his story as introduction to the world. And where I get thrown off track is I start to imagine these grand character arcs for sort of an epic fantasy style trilogy, and then I get involved in these big plotting gambles. It's a gamble because it takes up my time and distracts me. And what I really need to do is just try to tell the first story and then worry about the rest later. I really like my ideas that I've been coming up with this week and the thoughts that I've been having. I've been thinking a lot about having a character-driven story, which is something that Stephen King talks about a lot. He's a big believer in. He says all you have to do is put some interesting characters in an interesting situation, and then see how it plays out. And I've been thinking about that because I made a post on my Instagram this week about Neil Gaiman's American Gods, and I really felt like that novel is a good example of a story that suffers from having a main character who's just too inactive and who's not making the choices, and who's just sort of getting thrown around in this whirlwind of activity that other more powerful characters are imposing on him. And because of that, I felt like the novel was really boring. I mean, it was a great story overall, but as you read the thing, it's not a very exciting or emotional experience. At least I didn't think so. And I thought a lot of that had to do with the hero and the fact that the hero wasn't making the driving decisions. Back when I was writing the Turtle Island novel and I worked with my editor, she talked to me a lot about character agency and how especially your hero needs to be the one making these choices. And she had this whole diagram that she worked up. I think she called it, her system, she called it the agency tree, I believe. And I always remember this fun example that she told me about, which was, it was something like this. So you have a husband and a wife who are living together, no kids. They've been married for a long time. And one day the wife is rummaging around in the husband's office drawer because she's looking for a paper clip or something stupid. And she stumbles upon a document that shows that the husband has hired a private detective to follow her. And so that's sort of the inciting incident of the story. And if you imagine the wife, the woman, is our protagonist of this story. And then if you're the writer, you want to think about, okay, how can we, because what happened, the husband hiring a private detective to follow her is the inciting incident. That's what kicks off the story, but that's something that he's doing. So we want the wife, she's our protagonist. She needs to really drive the story. So if you think about it in terms of what's her agency, then it helps you decide what's the most interesting thing. What should the wife do next? She's the main character. So as a writer, you start running through your options and you think, well, maybe she thinks that this document is just a mistake. So she ignores it and goes back to her daily life. Well, that's certainly something she could do, but that's boring. It doesn't make for a good story. And there's endless options like that are like the most common things that would happen in real life, but would make for boring stories. So she could just take the document to her husband and say, hey, what the hell is this? And he says, oh, it's nothing, or he comes up with a good lie, or he brushes it off. Now that's a little more interesting. She's at least doing something in that scenario. She's confronting her husband, so you have conflict, you have tension there. So that's, getting warmer. And then, but then the best option, or the most interesting thing that's going to make the best story, is if the wife can make some sort of gamble, take some sort of big action herself, and really push the story forward on her own terms. So maybe the most interesting thing would be if she, in response to seeing this document from her husband, maybe she goes out to a private investigating firm and she hires Sherlock Holmes, Philip Marlowe, sort of private dick, to follow her husband. So we think about all those different options, and obviously, the last one with her hiring a private detective to follow her husband is obviously the most interesting. Now she's got skin in the game, she's taking a risk, but the best thing about not just that you want to choose the most extravagant option every time. Like you could think of all kinds of outrageous things. Like if she finds that document in the office, maybe she immediately picks up a gun and walks into the other room and holds the gun at her husband and demands that he tell her the truth. That's dramatic, but it's not good. It doesn't have any it's a good example of just trying too hard to be dramatic. You're just jumping straight to the end, to the great battle at the end, without any proper buildup. But if you think about the wife hiring someone to follow her husband, well, that's brilliant in a lot of ways, because the most important thing is she has the agency. So now it's her story. So something's happened to her, but now she's taking the action, and it's going to build up tension. Now you have the husband and the wife who are both secretly, who are both lying to each other. And then you have this great tense battle where every time they're going to interact in the house, there's going to be so many things that aren't being said, or so many lies. And that's a fun story. Like I would like to watch that movie. So I've always remembered that example that my editor told me about, and she was using that example to help me realize that my main character was being too passive, and that maybe he was more like the wife in the story, who just had something interesting happen to him, but then he just sort of went along with his regular life and didn't react to it in a way that was interesting. And so these last few weeks, while I've been sitting on my ass and recovering and elevating, ricing my leg. What is it? Rest, ice, compression, elevation. I subscribed to Netflix again, and I rewatched the first few episodes of Breaking Bad because I don't need to justify it, because Breaking Bad is the greatest TV show of all time. I think I've been thinking about Breaking Bad because of Game of Thrones. When this, when the discussion was going on about Game of Thrones and how it ended, it got me thinking about what other TV shows have done it right. And I've talked about this before, but I think really the big genius of Breaking Bad is that the writers just stuck to the character. It was a character-driven story that Stephen King would be proud of, which is this idea that you put a character in an interesting situation and then you just watch what happens. And I think that's a lot harder in an epic fantasy world like Game of Thrones, or another show, Lost, which was heavily criticized for having a shitty ending. When you have that many characters and that many storylines, it's just even harder and harder to wrap them all up in a natural way that doesn't feel forced by the writers and the producers. And so I've been thinking a lot about that, just clarity of focus. I talked before about how my story, I have this vision of the first scene where this this traveler comes to the Tomorrow City airport, and he has one thing that he's trying to do, but as he gets to the airport, he gets pulled into customs, and they tell him that he's a werewolf. And he says, "What the fuck are you talking about?" And they explain to him that he's a werewolf, and he says, "No, I'm not." He has no idea. And I've just been thinking about that inciting incident because I like that. I think it's fun and interesting. And then I've been thinking about how, well, if that's your inciting incident, you need to play that all the way out to the end. And then, what sort of agency can my character take? He's got to do something. He needs to act on that, like the example of the wife in the story who finds out that her husband is following her. She needs to take action and do something in an interesting way. And so back to Breaking Bad, the real genius of that whole story is just that, the inciting incident for Walt is that he has cancer. And that's the terrible thing that's happened to him. And if he were just to go along and get chemo and do the normal things that everybody does, then it wouldn't be an interesting story at all. It would just be a sort of regular life story. And what he does is, in response to the shitty hand that life has dealt him, he decides he's going to cook meth. And as I rewatched it, it just struck me as so brilliant how he made that one decision. So the first episode is all about him making that one decision. So Walt, in the first episode, he makes a deal with the devil. And the devil is, the devil can be represented by Jesse, who's his partner in crime. The devil can be represented by meth, which is the drug that he's making. But really, I was thinking about it, the devil that he makes a deal with is just going on the wrong side of the law. So Walt decides that he's going to be a criminal. So he decides that he can't get the money that he needs for his family, the money that he wants for his to help pay for all of his treatments. And also he's thinking about after he dies, he wants his family to be well off and not be stuck paying all his bills. And he just doesn't think he can get that money by any sort of legal means, and he just doesn't have it. So Walt makes a deal with the devil, which is, if I become a criminal, maybe I can get this money. I love that vision. I love the idea of Robert Johnson. I think that was his name. Whatever, the guitarist, the folklore, the musician who goes to the crossroads and sells his soul to the devil in exchange for whatever talent it is. I've been thinking about that with my own character because I love that trope. I love that interaction, and it's so brilliant the way it plays out in Breaking Bad. So Walt has a crisis. So the inciting incident is that he finds out he has cancer. There's that great scene where he is at the car wash and he just passes out and he's laying in a puddle. And the next scene, he's at the doctor, and the doctor is explaining to him all about his cancer. And meanwhile, Walt is just staring at the mustard stain on the doctor's lab coat collar. What's so brilliant about what happens next is that Walt decides to make drugs with his ex-student Jesse, and that's the point. So that's where he crosses the line. So he crosses the line, he makes a deal with the devil, now he's on the wrong side of the law. So at any point now, if Walt gets caught, he can go to jail. He's on the wrong side of the law at any point. And so every single thing that happens in the following episodes is just the first thing that happens in the first episode is that they make their first batch of meth, and then Jesse gets his dealers involved, and the dealers come in and try to strong-arm Walt. So Walt does this fun, his superpower is chemistry. So as the bad guys are hovering over him and Walt thinks they're going to kill him after he cooks the meth, he creates this like flash explosion with these chemicals and blinds his attackers and hurts them, and then he shuts them in the RV, and then And then so they get away. So anyways, Walt survives. But the point I'm making is that now, so the first episode ends and Walt's okay and they didn't get caught by the police. But now they have these two criminals in the back of their van who are mortally wounded. And so the whole next like 3 or 4 episodes is Walt and Jesse trying to deal with this. They're trying to, one of the criminals ends up dying, and so now they have to dispose of the body. And then the second criminal, he's still alive, so they have to figure out what to do with him. And then there's that amazing scene where Walt and the bad guy are in the basement together, and the bad guy is chained to the pole, and it's Walt's job to have to kill this guy. And it just struck me as so amazing how it all is just compounding. And so it all happened from Walt's initial choice to break bad. Even the show's title is fucking brilliant. Walt chose to break bad. And because he did that, now everything just compounds. Now he has to lie to his wife all the time. He has to lie to his friends and family all the time. And that's the deal with the devil that he made. And once he went south of that line, cooking drugs is okay, then, well, he's going to have to be okay with murder. He's going to have to be okay with theft and kidnapping and whatever else comes along with it, because now he's on the wrong side of that line. I don't know. Maybe I'll talk about Breaking Bad more at another time, but my point was just that I've been thinking a lot about that character agency and how can I have my character make a deal with the devil, and in a way that is organic and in a way that just naturally flows, like Walt's decision does, or like that example with the wife. If she hires a private investigator to follow her husband, well, that story is going to naturally flow on to the next set of events, and you can see how it's a really good setup to have this crescendo. So at some point, the truth's going to come out, and that's what we know about Walt, is that at some point down the road, the truth's going to come out. At some point, his family's going to find out. At some point, he's going to get caught by his brother-in-law, who's a DEA agent, and so it's all kind of built in. Like I talked about last time, the ending is in the beginning. The ending is encoded within the beginning, and I mean that's the genius of Breaking Bad. I mean, that's how I'll sum it up right there, is that as soon as Walt breaks bad, we know that in the end, the only way this can end is that he's either going to get away scot-free or he's going to get caught, and it's all going to be over and his life's going to be ruined. And the genius of that show is sticking to the character and not branching off in a million other directions and taking the story different directions, but just following that line all the way till the end, which is what they did. And that's why that ending is satisfying, and ending like Game of Thrones is not so satisfying. So let me tell you how I tried to get myself back on track this week after I'd been having different ideas about what I wanted my story to be, and I realized, I'm plotting this thing too much like a epic fantasy, and I'm thinking on too grand of a scale, and let me just bring it back down to my character and his choice and keep it small. The thing that I did that helped me get back on track a couple days ago was I went on Amazon. And on Amazon, I started looking at the categories. Maybe let me back up a little bit by saying that there's an author, his name is Chris Fox, and he's very famous, at least in the self-publishing world. He wrote a book called Right to Market. For me, Chris Fox embodies something about the self-publishing movement that I really appreciate, which is that he's smart and he's business-minded, and I think he came from the tech world, but he's not afraid to talk about the business side of self-publishing and to talk about writers as business owners. And a lot of times when you listen to self-publishing podcasts or listen to self-published authors, there's a lot of talk about this dichotomy between the traditional world and the self-published world, and between the true kind of pretentious, snobby artists who just write for the art and don't care about money, and then these sort of write for hire genre Pulp Fiction artists who are just writing for money and will sacrifice all of their artistic integrity. And I think those are two spectrums. That's the dichotomy that people are always going back and forth on. For me, and I'm sure it's this way for a lot of writers my age, I don't care about that pretentious bullshit. I'm not trying to be an artist among all artists. What I want to do is make a living. I want to be practical. I want to do the right thing. I want to make money. I don't want to write just to write, although I will do that anyways. But I guess what I'm saying is I see this dichotomy between traditional published authors, self-published authors, and then the true artists versus the sort of artists for hire. And I think those two polar opposites do represent different ends of the spectrum, which are true. But as with all of these sort of dichotomies, whether it's introverts and extroverts, whether it's Democrats and Republicans, whether it's men and women, whether it's pantser and plotter, whether it's whatever it is, I think the truth always lies somewhere in between. And when you're talking about the majority of people, they're in the gray area, and it's only the fringe, it's only the rare few people who are on the ultimate polar opposites of any of those spectrums. And so one thing I really appreciate about the self-publishing community is that they do, self-published authors, hopefully I can include myself in that group before this year's over. We do want to write the best work that we can write. We are interested in our artistic integrity, and we are interested in finding our voice, and we are interested in telling the best story. But at the same time, we're interested in making money. Self-published authors are interested in marketing, running Amazon ads, running Facebook ads, doing book promos, having a mailing list, getting signups, doing joint promotions with other authors, doing box sets, whatever it is. Self-published authors are in the business of living. They're in the business of supporting their families. They're in the business of putting their kids through school. They're in the business of paying off their student loans. And I like that. And I think that Chris Fox, so that was a tangent, but I think that Chris Fox represents that aspect of the self-publishing community, and he wrote some of the foundational texts that a lot of, if you're a newbie self-published author and you're trying to find information, you'll get pointed toward his work a lot. So Chris Fox's most famous nonfiction work is called Right to Market. And the premise of Right to Market is that inexperienced authors write some shit, and then they afterward try to figure out how to market it, who's my audience, what genre is this, whereas experienced authors or wiser authors who've been around, who have the know-how, they already have the market in mind before they even think about their cover or their first paragraph or the blurb or the hook of this new story they're going to write. And so Chris Fox goes into depth in his book about how to find the right market, how to find the genre that you want to write in, where your passion and sort of the needs of the market intersect. And I always thought that was smart, and that was the reason that I wrote epic fantasy in the beginning, because epic fantasy is what I loved. I didn't think that I would be an epic fantasy master. I didn't think that epic fantasy would be the end all for me, but I did think that, hey, I like this. I'm interested enough in it that I can write. And obviously it's a big market. A lot of people read epic fantasy. So that was a simple idea, sort of a no-brainer for me that, hey, I can write. This is a popular market. It's not like writing, contemporary romance westerns or something that's a little more obscure. It's not like writing paranormal mixed relationship lit RPG. It's something that's more obscure. No, it's well, and that's interesting too, because there's a lot of benefit or potential upside of being one of the few people in your genre, especially if your genre is underserved. Anyway, I'm getting off track here, but the point is that Chris Fox and his right to market ideas have always resonated with me, and I always thought that was smart, and I always thought, yeah, duh, that makes sense. It's important to know who your audience is. One of my few friends I have who's a business owner who actually built his own business, he's talked to me about how one of the biggest leaps in his business was when he was able to identify who his customer really was, and to narrow down his focus, to narrow the focus of his business to exactly who their customer was, and to specify what sort of product they were putting out. And that always just made a lot of sense to me. It's that idea that if you're marketing to everybody, then you're sort of marketing to nobody. Over the weekend, maybe it was Monday, I went on Amazon.com. And I was looking at ebooks. And then the thing that happens when you pull down the ebooks category is that you can choose what you want. So I choose, when you select ebooks on Amazon, then you can choose your category from there. You can get more specific. So I chose sci-fi and fantasy. And as soon as you choose that, then you start to see Harry Potter and Game of Thrones and some of those really famous texts. And then further down the rabbit hole, I chose fantasy. So we throw out all the sci-fi stuff, and now we're seeing Harry Potter and some old classics like Dune by Frank Herbert, and we're seeing what else? Well, you're seeing a lot of Game of Thrones stuff in the fantasy world. And then I narrowed it down further from there. I went paranormal and urban. And in paranormal and urban, you still see some Harry Potter, but now you start to get into some other more obscure, well, really famous authors who are really killing it. But if you're not a paranormal or urban fantasy author, if you're not a paranormal or urban fantasy reader, then you probably don't know who these authors are, like Jim Butcher or Patricia Briggs. And I was scrolling down that list, and I saw some books that caught my eye. So one of the first things I saw was this trilogy, which is apparently huge. It's very popular. It's called the All Souls trilogy, and it's written by a woman named Deborah Harkness. And I had never heard of this trilogy before, but it's obviously big and has a big following, and I think it's even been made into a television show. Either it has been made into a TV show, or it's very close to getting made into a TV show. But what really drew me in at first when I saw these books from Deborah Harkness, there's 3 of them. They're called the All Souls trilogy, but the first one is called A Discovery of Witches. And the covers are just fucking perfect. They're beautiful. They have these dark backgrounds, and then they have really bright white lettering. So the title of the novel is front and center, and it's in white, and then the author's name is in white, but then everything behind that is dark faded colors. But what's amazing about these covers that really stood out to me was that they look great as little thumbnails, and that's really important when you are designing your book cover, is that you have to keep in mind that a lot of people are scrolling on their phone, and they're just going to see a small thumbnail of your image, and it needs to look good at that scale. But what's awesome about these covers is they do both really well. They look good as small thumbnails because of the white lettering on the dark backgrounds. But then when you see the larger image, they're still very fascinating. You can actually just like I'm looking at it on my phone right now, and it's just fun to look at. The more you look at the cover, there's all this detail. It's sort of a mysterious constellation, starry night background with astrological symbols. And, just at a glance, it all sort of blends into the background. But then if you really want to look at it, the cover is actually really beautiful and very detailed. And even at the bottom, there's a city. And I'm just looking at it. I know the story takes place in Oxford, takes place in London, but I'm looking at this right now on the cover of the first novel, and I would just guess maybe it's in Italy somewhere. It looks European. There are these buildings with domes. And so that's also very important. None of these things that you see on the cover are done by accident. They're all conscious decisions, and they all make sense. And so on this Discovery of Witches cover, the bottom third of the cover is the skyline of a city, and that's important because it lets you know that you're reading urban fantasy as opposed to maybe epic fantasy or sword and sorcery fantasy. So that wrapped me in just right off the bat, and I've spent a few years now listening to self-published authors talk about the importance of branding and genre identification and the importance of getting a good cover designer. And when I saw these, I was just blown away, and they worked. I bought the first book. Like I actually spent $8 on it, or $9 or whatever it was, because it was a great cover, and I saw how much hype these stories had, and I bought it. Johnny come lately to this All Souls trilogy. Like I said, they've already been made into a TV series. But if you have been listening to any of the previous shows, you know that what I love to do, one of the things I love to do is take a famous series like this and read the very beginning of it and see how they, obviously this author, Deborah Harkness, she's had huge success. And so it's fascinating to me as a new author to see how did she kick that off. What was the first novel like? Even on a smaller, more detailed level, what is that first chapter like? What is that first paragraph like? So here is the first paragraph of A Discovery of Witches by Deborah Harkness. The leather-bound volume was nothing remarkable. To an ordinary historian, it would have looked no different from hundreds of other manuscripts in Oxford's Bodleian Library, ancient and worn. But I knew there was something odd about it from the moment I collected it. The thing I like about this intro is that it doesn't hit you over the head with over-dramatic fight scenes or someone holding a gun to somebody's head or the last day of someone's life, or, it's not overly dramatic, but it is mysterious, and it does hook you in with just a simple mystery. Here's a magical book. Here's a regular person, by all accounts, who's in the library. And there's something special about this book. And an ordinary historian would not have noticed, but our protagonist, they knew. I knew there was something odd about it from the moment I collected it. I think it's a good hook. I think it's a good start. I'm interested. I want to know what is in the book. I want to know what it is. And as I went on to read the first chapter, I got all good vibes from Deborah Harkness. I'm actually excited to read this novel. It's roped me in. She did everything right, from the marketing and the branding with the cover pulled me in. And then she had all the good reviews. And then I saw that it was popular, so I had this sort of social, what would you call that? The social opinion, or the popular, what am I trying to say? Where humans are social creatures, and so, what is it? Social proof? Social accountability? I saw that a bunch of other people liked it, so that made me let down my gates and made me more prone to like it too. But I bought it, and I really liked it from the beginning, and I'm excited to see what she does. Now, on the other hand, I Actually, I bought 2 books that night when I was browsing in the urban fantasy and paranormal genre. I bought the A Discovery of Witches story, and then I bought a second book, which is called Harley Merlin and the Secret Coven by Bella Forrest. Now, Bella Forrest is just fucking killing it. I don't know, maybe she was self-published, but now she's traditional. I feel like I've heard interviews with her before, just with what how much I've listened to the self-publishing world and heard interviews over the years. Her name has come up. But anyway, she's massive. Everything she writes is a bestseller. She's done everything right. She has a huge fan base. She wrote this other series called, I think, The Gender Game, which was an obvious play towards fans of the Hunger Games. But she made a whole series out of it, and she's just a good writer, and she'll write in different genres. She probably is the best, maybe one of the best examples of someone who took Chris Fox's advice, right to market, totally seriously. And she's just a good writer who just pumps out stories at an incredible rate. And who knows, she might have been doing this long before Chris Fox gave his advice. I haven't done my research on that. But anyways, Bella Forrest, huge name. She's killing it. She's putting her imprint into the urban and paranormal market. And this story is called Harley, Merlin, and the Secret Coven. And I'm going to read to you the first, it actually starts with a prologue, the first few paragraphs of this Harley Merlin story. And then I'm going to try to figure out why I hate it so much. Because it's a very different style, and it's different than what I just read previously with A Discovery of Witches. And maybe I shouldn't have prefaced it with that just to give you the expectation that it's not good. Maybe I should have just said, maybe I shouldn't have said beforehand that I don't like it, but whatever. Just being honest here. I'm going to read the first part of this Harley Merlin story, and then you can judge for yourself what you think. Prologue. I froze, my back against the window, my whole body shivering as the beast in front of me shuddered with delight. Another second, and I would become its dinner. Something inside me roared like thunder, unwilling to give in yet. The air around me thickened. I could feel it tickling my fingertips, beckoning me to wield it. I'd done it before, though not with the strength I would need to disable a fiend as savage as this. But I had to try. There was no other choice. I summoned all the energy I could muster, and for the first time ever, I sensed the particles of chaos flowing through me. My mind went into overdrive, and I thrust my hands out. The winds outside listened, rumbling and whistling as they crashed through the window. I ducked as broken glass exploded everywhere. Shards cut through the beast's face and eyes, and it hissed from the pain. With no other route to safety, I embraced the winds and leapt onto the windowsill. My breath hitched as I looked down at the sheer drop, and then I closed my eyes, abandoning myself to the air. All right, so why does this bother me so much? I feel like everything that just happened in that prologue is everything that I don't like about young adult stories. And a lot of what I don't like about young adult stories seems to have bled over into urban fantasy. Patricia Briggs is an author who I heard was a must-read staple in the genre that I read, and I just didn't enjoy it at all. I think even Jim Butcher, for as famous as he is, his writing style suffers from some of this. It's just so boring to me. The whole, every paragraph starts with I froze, I shuddered, my fingertips twinkled, I did this, I did that, I did this. It's just sort of, it's such a reporting style. I don't know, it's so bland to me. And it also is sort of melodramatic in a sort of teenage, I just can't put my finger on it. I've been annoyed by this ever since I started reading. I read a Patrick Ness book. Who he's a big young adult author, and I liked his story okay, but the scenes, the chapters, the book itself was just not a fun reading experience. As soon as I read this prologue by Bella Forrest, I just realized, like, okay, I'm not gonna like this book. Okay, I'm not gonna enjoy this. And I went on to read chapter 1, and it's interesting because there's a witch, or she's what is called an empath, and she is this young woman who works at a casino, and she can read other people's emotions, and so her job is to catch other people who are cheating at poker or whatever and to turn them in. So she's like a security officer. She's basically like a professional tattletale, which that's annoying. I immediately don't want to root for that character. I'd rather watch Ocean's 11, or those thief movies are fun. We like to root for the bad guy in some scenarios, but her, right off the bat, the main character, she's just a snitch. It's like, how are you gonna become endeared to a snitch? The gambler, the ones who are cheating the system, they're more interesting to me. But our protagonist is a professional tattletale. I don't know. I'm just not a big fan of it. I am obviously not fit to even say Bella Forrest's name. She is killing it. I hope she continues to kill it. Whatever she's doing right, and she has a lot of people who love her stories. But it really just struck me this weekend as I read the beginning of Discovery of Witches, and then I read the beginning of this Harley Merlin story, and they were just so different, and it was so obvious to me which one I liked, which one just grated me the wrong way. But the Discovery of Witches story, it's so subtle, it's so nice, it feels planned out, it feels like there's a purpose to the story. Like, when we jump into a Discovery of Witches, it's not the protagonist saying, I walked into the library and I saw this handsome man and I pulled up a chair. It's like you're just reporting events when you talk like that. But the way that Discovery of Witches started is the book. We're talking about the book. When I first opened the book, I felt a special energy from the book, and I didn't know what it was. And I debate, the whole first chapter is about her conflict, whether she should engage in this mystery or not. And to me, that's subtle and it's powerful and it's intriguing. But when I read these, like this Bella Forrest story, it just doesn't engage me at all. It's an action hero who's doing one amazing thing to the next. I don't know. I guess what I'll do is I need to read more. I'm definitely going to read more of A Discovery of Witches, and I'll force myself to read a little bit more of this Bella Forrest story, and I'll report back more about if my opinions changed or how I feel about it. I'm actually really excited about this All Souls trilogy, and I hope they're all awesome. I hope they fucking blow me away, because I haven't had a series like that in a while. So I promise I'll come back and I'll get more into depth with both of these stories, and maybe I'll think more about this writing in the first person and this young adult style, and what it is that really bugs me about stories like this one, this Bella Forrest story. But for now, let me bring it all back home by saying that the whole reason I went off on this tangent about, I bought these 2 urban fantasy novels is because I talked before about how my problem is that I brainstorm too much and I run off on too many different railroad tracks, and I can't ever bring it back home, and I can never specify enough just to work on my story. And so one thing that I think has been helpful to me, or that I'm trying to do this week, is thinking about this right to market principle. Thinking about urban fantasy, reminding myself that, hey, you're writing urban fantasy, not epic fantasy, not a sort of contemporary family action, suburban family drama like Walter White and Breaking Bad. As much as I love those stories, and as much as I think those lessons are valuable for having a main character who is active and who has a lot of agency, I'm not writing a Breaking Bad story. I'm writing an urban fantasy story. And even just making those genre decisions helps me to cut through some of that bullshit, to cut out some of those ideas, and to just focus on, all right, what you're doing here is you're talking about a world. There's a regular world that exists. And then, behind the veil, there's the magical world. There's the fantastical world. That's what's so great about urban fantasy. Whether it's Harry Potter or The Magicians by Lev Grossman, or any of these other famous urban fantasy novels I've been mentioning, there's the regular world, and then sort of just behind the thin veil, there's a fantastical world. And that's why the mystery is so powerful, and that's what I think the reader, as an urban fantasy fan, that's what I really live for. That's what I look forward to. That's what I want. That's the shot in the veins that I get, is this sort of surprise when Harry is in his family's living room and all the owls start bringing in the letters, and the letters are just fucking filling the house. And such a great scene. And it's what it is. And it is an intrusion of the magical into the regular human world. And that's what urban fantasies get high on, is this sort of interplay between, this sort of dangerous interaction between the magical world and the real world. And then, that character who thinks they're a muggle, who thinks they can never be a wizard, that character who is a regular person at first, like all of us, but then gets to transition into the magical world and find out that there's more to life, and find out that magic really exists. I think that really is the hit of morphine that the urban fantasy reader lives for. And so that's helped me as I think about my werewolf story. It's helped me to see how Deborah Harkness did it, where her protagonist is a witch who's a historian. Because one thing that urban fantasy readers love is to see these sort of supernatural creatures living in a regular environment. Even in the Bella Forrest story, to see someone who can read other people's minds, but then they're just working at a casino trying to pay the bills. We like that as urban fantasy fans. We like to see people with special powers who are just getting by in the world because we can relate to them. So that helps me as I think about my werewolf character and where my story is going to go. So what I'm telling myself this week as I come back to my Tomorrow City story, and I'm brainstorming, and I'm so close, I'm so excited to get to the point where I can actually write the story and share it and put it on blogs and put it on Scribophile and share with other readers. I just want to skip ahead to that point, but I'm still a long ways from that. But where I am now with the brainstorming and the ideas, I feel like I'm close to a breakthrough. I really do. I feel like I'm close to figuring out what this story actually is. And the difficulty of that is avoiding my tendency to run off down too many different trails and to see too many shiny things, and to, like I said, it really is death by too many choices. What I need to do, what's helpful to me is just the more specific I can get, the more I can limit my own options. And that's why going back to Amazon, looking at these other urban fantasy novels like the All Souls trilogy and like the Harley Merlin stories, it helps me realize the genre that I'm in, what people like when they're reading in that genre, And the best thing that I can do as a fledgling writer is to try to copy what other writers have done well, but adapt that into a world that is familiar to me and with themes and motives and characters that I know about. Man, I just never thought that writing a novel would be so personally revealing. But it just makes me have huge respect for the people who've done it, for the writers that I'm emulating, and the writers who've come before me, and not just writers, but all creatives who have pushed through those feelings of insecurity and been able to produce and create and put themselves out in the world. And that's what we're all working towards, baby. Again, I'm really thankful for this podcast and the way it holds me accountable, and I'm really thankful for you guys, for the reviews that I've been getting on iTunes and the few emails and DMs that I've received lately. This thing is a journey, and it's hard to try and be a creative once you get into your 30s and 40s and 50s, and all of life is sort of happening around you, and you try to steal these, few minutes or 30 minutes or an hour a day to yourself, where your family's not dragging you one way, and errands and money and all the things that adulthood keeps you busy with. It's hard. And that's why I think it's worth doing, and that's why I love it so much, and that's why I'm excited to work on my story more this week, rejuvenated with these ideas of writing to market, and reminding myself that, okay, I'm working on an urban fantasy, and there are certain things that urban fantasy does well, and as a newbie author, I need to not try and think outside the box. I need to stick to the plan as much as I can and do what other authors have done well. So that's why it's fun for me to, pick up a couple novels like these ones I got this week. And I will report back more with what I think about, especially with Deborah Harkness's story. And if you've read these, and if you know these stories, and if you think I'm silly because I picked them up so late, please let me know what you think. I'm sure there are a ton of fans out there who love these stories because they're so popular. I think I'm going to leave it there for tonight. It's been a full episode. I've been all over the place, but I feel like I've been charged up from one point to the other. Actually, most times it's hard to get talking, but tonight I feel like I just couldn't shut up, and I was just going from one thing to the other stream of consciousness, and never slowing down to figure out where I was going. So now we're here, and we got a full episode, and that's what Wednesdays are for. Wednesdays are for refocusing, taking stock, seeing where you're at in the week, and I'm back to work tomorrow, Friday, this weekend, back to writing. I promise to report back next week. Thank you so much to everyone who is listening and who's supporting me on this journey. I can't thank you enough, honestly. I hope that wherever you are on the same journey, that this inspires you in some way. And I hope that you all have a blessed week. And I will be back next Wednesday with more, as always.